technology across the Asia Pacific business. So please welcome Sheridan to the stage.
Alrighty. I want to start with a question. So put your hand up if you remembered what you wanted to be when you were growing up. Anyone want to share? No, really? I'll share then. I wanted to be a journalist, like the whole time from when I was a little girl until I was a grown adult, and fortunately 3 years at journalism school cured me of that. So when I left university, I was looking for a new career, and it was around the time of the dot-com boom, so anyone could get a career in technology, so that's where I ended up. And that was my first true career love, right? This world of technology that I entered into. So when I fast forward to 2008, I was living in Shanghai. I just finished my master's degree, trying to work out what to do next. And I thought I'd just take a quick detour away from technology and I'll go into property. It was only meant to be for 6 months, and here I am all these years later with my second great love of my career, which is property. And so I'm fortunate enough, I have this privilege that I live out every day where I get to combine my two great loves, property and technology. And unlike any other area of technology, this is an area where you don't just get to play in people's digital world, you also get to play in their physical world. And I'm going to tell you, magic can happen when you put those two things together. So I'm going to take you for a little tour through my world, the world of Proptech, this morning, and have a look at whether or not COVID actually gave us maybe a push that we needed in the right direction. So let's get started, and let's get started by what the hell do I mean by Proptech. So there's lots of definitions of this out there. We have a very simple one, and that's that we're reimagining processes and data and practices in the built world through the application of not just technology, but importantly of data. And so that is all of the different technologies that you probably read about in the papers and see on the news, analytics, automation, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, blockchain, virtual reality, augmented reality, digital twins, you name it. But what makes it Proptech is that it's these technologies are specifically designed for the types of challenges that we face in the built world. Lots of benefits here of starting to adopt Proptech. Probably the one that I love the most is it gives us the benefit of certainty. So particularly when we're leveraging data and analytics in our decision-making processes. So that's anywhere in the life cycle. It could be in the development process, what should we build? Could be an acquisition, what should we buy? Could be in the operations of our assets, so where should we spend capital in order to drive the best possible outcomes in our existing property portfolio? And then how do we actually track those decisions into reality to ensure that we actually get the bang for the buck of whatever we invest? Efficiency is really important, again, through data and analytics. We're always looking at ways that we can operate our buildings more efficiently, more cost-effectively, in a way that reduces their impact on the planet. So efficiency is a really cool benefit of Proptech, as is experience. And there's lots of different elements of experience. It can be how we provide data and insights and information to our tenants and our investors through the use of digital channels. And it can even be how we're connecting our building communities to the amenities in the building, like the yoga classes and the sustainability chats, through their mobile devices, which I'll show you in a sec. Wellbeing, obviously, this became kind of important the last few years, but how do we protect the physical health of our building communities? And then what I'll broadly call governance. So how do we protect our buildings from risk? So that might be risks around physical security. It could be protecting the digital assets within our buildings. Cyber threats have been increasing over the past few years. It's really important we don't just protect the physical asset, but also the digital assets that are contained within a building. And then obviously the risk of environmental impact. So depending on the stats that you read, up to 30% of the emissions globally are produced by commercial buildings. So we clearly have a role to play, as everyone has talked about, in reducing that impact. Lots of benefits, but also lots of options are available to us in the Proptech world, largely because of this. So what you're looking at here is investment in Proptech. It's becoming quite a little industry all of its own. This is global investment, and you can see from 2015 onwards, we start to see a pretty exponential growth in the amount of money being invested in Proptech companies that are producing these technologies. So last year, after being just above $2 billion in 2015, last year we were projected to hit the $10 billion mark for the very first time. And what that essentially means, and by the way, 2020 was COVID. People got a bit skittish about investing in Proptech companies, but we've seen that strong bounce back. But what it actually means is this: there are plenty of Proptech companies out there to choose from, solving for challenges that we see across the entire life cycle of property. So all the way from investment, so how do we raise capital? How do we source and acquire buildings and manage those transactions? How do we design, construct, fit out buildings in the development process? And then every aspect of how we manage a building, all the way from the financial aspects of leasing and asset management to the day-to-day operation of the facility and the building. Sustainability is a very core focus of Proptech, as is experience, wellbeing, workplace, and those risk elements that I spoke about a few seconds ago. The problem with that is there's a lot of noise and hype in this area. There's a lot of chaff, and we spend a lot of time trying to sort the wheat from the chaff and make sure that the companies that we're choosing to work with are actually solving the problems that we have, and we're not just deploying technology for technology's sake. Here's where companies like owners like us and others are actually adopting Proptech. What we've seen, and this is actually quite an old survey now, it was taken pre-COVID, so we're just over halfway through the horizon that it talks about. So let me just walk you through it. The greatest adoption, if you look at the light blue chart, has been in the manage area. So what you're looking at there is that 65% of those surveyed had expected or had adopted Proptech in the way that they manage buildings or had a plan to over the next year. That number grows to 86% over a 5-year horizon. So most people surveyed would have expected to use Proptech in the way they manage their buildings within a 5-year period. The numbers are roughly similar in development, where there's plenty of opportunities to drive efficiencies and decision-making and to reduce risk. But what we saw back then was that not so much adoption in the investment space, but with the highest potential growth rate over the next 5-year period. And I'd have to say that this feels spot on to where we are now. A number of different Proptech companies have come into that investment area, and we're seeing much greater adoption at that point in our life cycle, which is kind of exciting. Unfortunately, with all of those choices, we are not seen as a leader in how we're adopting Proptech globally. And when I say we, I mean Australia, not Charter Hall. I think we're smashing it. But we are seen as about the same or trailing across all asset classes: industrial, retail, residential, and office, which makes me sad that we're seen as trailing the most in office. And I don't actually think that's necessarily true, because I think there's some areas in office where Australia is actually leading the charge globally, like tenant experience, where we've seen not only widespread adoption of technology, but we've seen some of the leading tenant experience apps actually come from Australia and now taking their technology to the global stage. Now, the leaders are probably, unsurprisingly, the US, the UK, China. Smaller countries like Israel and Netherlands are seen as really leading Proptech. The reason I think for this is multifaceted. I think it's a small market here. It's very hard to attract some of the global Proptech companies to Australia because it's just not that financially viable for them. We don't have very good access to data in a democratised way like they do in markets like the US and the UK. There's not a lot of government support for innovation, and I think that leads to a relatively weak ecosystem and support for Proptech companies to be homegrown. And frankly, I think we just love Excel. So it's very, very hard to compete with that beautiful product. But I think COVID changed that to some extent. I think it gave us an opportunity to stop and reflect and maybe think about how we can move forward differently with technology. Because COVID kind of did this. This is like I'm such a geek. This is like my favourite meme from the COVID period. It's kind of depressing too, because I've spent 20 years of my life trying to convince people that they need to digitally transform, and all I actually needed was a pandemic. So, because, we did this, right, in our personal lives. How quickly did we just move to Zoom and Teams for meetings? How quickly did companies, retailers that had never served customers except at their physical stores, suddenly overnight they have these digital shop fronts? I mean, in every aspect of society, we just started to use technology because the situation required us to. And I think we were left really stunned by just how quickly people did that. And we're starting to see that momentum continue into this what I'm going to call the post-COVID world, but I'm an optimist. So let's have a look at how that played out in the property world during COVID, in this post-COVID world, and then maybe where we might be heading into the future. The first thing that happened for us in the COVID world was performance. Clearly, when lockdowns hit and the pandemic became widely spread, there was a lot of skittishness with our investors looking to say, well, what's going to go on with property valuations? What's the impact going to be of tenant rent relief? What does occupancy look like in our buildings, and how's that trending? So we were able to use, we had the systems in place already, we just had to reconfigure them to provide all of the information that was required to our tenants and our investors. And that just wouldn't have been possible at the speed in which we needed to work and at the scale that we needed to work on Excel. So it was really great that we'd made some investments previously that got us there. We talked a little bit about connecting our building communities with the amenities in the building through our lovely Charlie app, which our building communities are free to download. We actually used Charlie in a different way during the COVID time, so clearly people weren't coming into our buildings, but we used Charlie as a way of connecting people with resources that they needed during COVID, and when we were ready to welcome people back into our office buildings, we used that to inform people about what the COVID-safe plans were and what they could expect when they turned back up to the office on day one. Clearly, we could not invite people to come and inspect any available spaces we had, so we widely used virtual inspections to allow people that couldn't be in that space or couldn't travel to that space to get a sense of what our available spaces look like, how they could be fitted out. So virtual became a really cool way that we were able to keep things moving during the COVID period. Obviously, biosafety became really important. How do we protect people when they come back into primarily our office buildings? And we started to trial a bunch of new technology like thermal scanning, so checking people's temperatures on the way in. We looked at UV cleaning, so for high frequency and high touch surfaces, using UV light to automatically clean those. And we used a lot of occupancy and data and analytics to manage capacity in our buildings, particularly when we had, restrictions on how many people could be in lifts or in the space itself. And then cyber safety also became really important pre-COVID and through the COVID years. Cyber attacks have definitely been on the rise. And when you add into that a lot of the services in the building were being done remotely, it creates an even greater risk. So we spent a lot of time with Proptech companies solving for these challenges so that we could, as I said before, protect the digital assets that were in our buildings, not just the physical ones. I think it was Richard yesterday talked about not just the economic headwinds that we're facing into, but the socio-economic headwinds that we're facing into. So as we step into this post-COVID world, I think what you'll see in the world of Proptech will broadly match some of those socio-economic trends that we are confronting over the next year or two. So hybrid working is clearly something we've been talking a little bit about this last few days. But we're going to have to start moving beyond basic occupancy and saying how many people are coming into our buildings to really helping our tenants understand how are individual spaces being used in their individual tenancies, so that we can redesign those spaces and provide more of the types of spaces that people want to come into the office and use. So that'll be things like meeting rooms and collaborative spaces, social spaces, but we're going to, the best way for us to do that is really to do it by using sensors and counters so that we can do this kind of heat mapping. And to be providing experiences that really earn the commute so that people want to come in and spend time with each other in the offices. I think wellbeing will continue to be really important, but it'll be less about like stopping people from coming into the building if they've got a temperature, and more around being very thoughtful around protecting people's safety when they're in the building. So I've spent an extraordinary amount of time in this post-COVID world looking at things that people touch in the office. You have no idea how many things you touch when you go to the toilet. Like it's quite frightening. So we're looking at all those touch points and trying to work out which of them we can make contactless. So now when you walk into our toilets, you just wave your hand to open the door so that we're reducing the chance of disease transmission through touch. We'll be looking at really advanced ways of managing ventilation and air quality, because that's really important to people's physical health and well-being, as well as, was it you, Sean, yesterday, or Shane? That talked about end of trip and the importance of end of trip. So we'll be using tech to really ramp up end of trip and car parking so that people that don't want to come in on public transport really have viable options for coming in via other means that they might find a bit more safe. The war for talent has been mentioned. As migration patterns return back to normal and wages rise, I think you'll see a lot more automation and artificial intelligence employed in the property industry. And that won't be necessarily to replace the humans. It will be more about taking people's mundane work away, so copying and pasting from spreadsheets to PowerPoints, all that stuff that kind of is just not the best use of our day, and moving from that mundane work into far more meaningful work. So expect to see a fair bit more in the world of automation and artificial intelligence. And then I don't need to really harp on about this, but a really big focus over the next couple of years is going to be around sustainability. And there's plenty of ways that technology enables us to get to our net zero targets, whether it's innovative new materials to reduce the embodied carbon in our buildings, looking at alternative energy sources like solar, climate scenario modelling, and forward pricing of carbon credit units. That will all rely on data and technology. Then the obvious stuff around reducing and optimising energy in our buildings and making sure that we're making all the improvements necessary to reduce those emissions. I mean, I think we need to be really clear that we're not going to get to net zero without technology, so everybody should really be looking into this space, as well as I think this is one area where Australia really could lead the world in PropTech development and adoption. So moving beyond that, maybe further out into this horizon, what's going to happen in this world? And I think it starts to get both exciting and a little bit scary. The first thing I think that will be really interesting will be self-aware buildings. So we're going to have buildings that understand how things are operating within the building, including core equipment, so that they can predict and understand when something is about to fail, and that they can order their own parts and maintenance and really change the whole way that we're operating those buildings. I think buildings will become more aware of what they are in the wider context of smart cities. So as we start to adopt things like autonomous vehicles, buildings will be able to talk to other aspects of the smart city to make really good decisions about transport and travel and mobility and the like. So buildings are just going to get a whole lot more clever. If anyone hasn't heard of the Metaverse, you might have been living under a rock, because it feels like this is all I read about these days. But there'll be a property aspect to the Metaverse. Traditionally, so just as a primer, the Metaverse has really been the domain of gamers, but it's essentially a virtual world where you interact with other people's avatars, either on screen or using a virtual reality headset. So companies, traditionally it has been for gamers, but you sort of see companies like, Meta, the formerly called Facebook, and Microsoft starting to move into this space to create a metaverse for our day-to-day working. So their dream is that actually we will meet and collaborate together and socialise and do all those things in this virtual world rather than coming into offices. I don't want to actually be working when that happens. That sounds awful to me, but already you've got companies. This actual picture is from Accenture's. They've built this digital workspace which they use for onboarding activities. So they've got obviously tens of thousands of employees around the world, and so they use this space to onboard their employees and allow those employees to socialise with one another, no matter where they are geographically. And then you've got some US property owners that recently have started building digital replicas of their buildings in the Metaverse. I'm not sure for what purpose, but like everyone loves to jump on a bandwagon. And then here's the other one that I think is really important to watch, and I find this a little bit scary, if I'm honest, from a privacy and ethics point of view, but there's this whole field right now around emotional technology. So this is really where technology is reading your facial expressions, it's reading other physiological signs like your heart rate, and then using all of that data to try to adapt your physical space to change your emotional state. I mean, I was reading on the weekend that Zoom is actually thinking about putting this into their technology now, so work that out. So you're turning up to a Zoom meeting, it's reading your facial expression, and then I don't know what they're going to do with that data, but it's kind of frightening, right? Like maybe they'll send it to your boss. So right now, imagine we're all on a Zoom call. Like David Harrison, my boss, is getting like an alert saying, Sheridan turned up to work really hungover today. I mean, you can laugh, but your bosses are all getting that same alert. So, but I find that, I don't know, does anyone else find that frightening? I find that really frightening that technology companies would try to alter your emotions or even try to read them in the first place. So I'm not entirely comfortable with some of the ways that PropTech will be changing in the future. So that's about it from me. I just thought I might finish up with some top tips. So if you're in a fund investing with an owner, here's some of the things that I think you should really watch out for. The first is be really wary of people that are just talking about technology, right? You should be looking for adopters that are talking about the outcomes that they delivered through technology, because there is a lot of talkers in this area and not a whole lot of doers, in my opinion. We should be looking for the scale of outcomes. A lot of people will talk about, and we've been guilty of this as well, the latest smart building that we've developed. But actually, the real outcomes from PropTech are most visible when you implement them at the portfolio level, and it's much, much harder to adopt Proptech in your existing portfolio than it is when you're building a building from scratch. So look for who has actually scaled those outcomes across their entire property portfolio. As we just talked about with emotional technology, I think that you should be looking for companies that have a strong ethical grounding. I think in the coming years we will be forced to ask ourselves often, just because we can do something, should we do it? And in whose interests are we serving? So look for companies that are really tackling this. We're a founding member. I spend a lot of my personal time working with the Sustainable Digitalisation Project, which is all about trying to make sure the built environment adopts technology in ways which are sustainable and ethical. So if anyone wants any further information about that, we're developing a framework that can be applied any time you are adopting technology, so you're thinking through the ethical and the kind of questions that you should be thinking through to make sure that you're doing things in the interest of your users. And then I see a lot of people actually starting to invest directly with PropTech companies. It's like we all got the memo that tech stocks boomed, and now there's a bunch of people starting to just do direct investments with PropTech. I would be just tread carefully. I mean, there's venture capitalists out there that are experts at where to invest in this area, but frankly, there's a really high failure rate of PropTech companies. You saw all those logos before. Many of those companies no longer exist. And so it's going to be very unlikely, I think, that PropTech produces a unicorn or a company that's valued at over $1 billion. So I just think be careful when really sort of thinking in an